We will now begin our plenary session. Our speakers at this plenary today are Professor Cara Cilano of Michigan State University. Her talk is titled Imagined Identifications, Reading as Learned Activity. And we also have Professor Sudeep Chakravarti, writer, journalist, and visiting professor at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh, whose talk is titled The Bengalis, Myth and Reality Between the Shadow Lines. This session is chaired by Professor Shamshad Mortaza, Pro-Vice Chancellor ULAB and Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. Sir, may I please request you to start the session?
Off to our first plenary session, and I'm really excited to welcome, two of our esteemed panelists. First off, we have Dr. Cara Cilano. So she's a professor of English, associate dean for undergraduate studies, Pakistan studies, post-colonial studies, and Cold War studies. As we talked about the potential Third World War, so maybe it's becoming even more pertinent. So Dr. Cara Cilano, she authored 3 books, including one on Pakistani literature, and she had numerous articles. She was a Fulbrighter, and she joined the Department of English at Michigan State as chairperson in 2016. She served the editorial board of the Michigan State University Press, and she also served as the secretary of the American Institute of Pakistan Studies. The title of her talk today is Imagined Identifications, Reading as Learned Activity. Professor Cilano, over to you. I know you gave us a handout and we posted it online. I don't know how many of us have done their homework, but yeah, we're really excited to have you on board. And over to Dr. Cilano.
Thank you so much for that really warm welcome. And I apologize for giving you homework, especially since my talk, you know how these things go. You start going and pretty soon you're not even getting to all the points that you were hoping to make. I am so thrilled to be here. I know that it is morning for you, but it is close to the middle of the night for me. It's snowing outside. Here in Michigan, it's very cold. So greetings from snowy, wintry Michigan in the middle of the night. Thank you so much to all the conclave's organizers for giving me this opportunity. As I say, I'm really excited to have a chance to follow some ideas that I'm hoping as other literary scholars, other liberal artists, other humanists, you might find interesting for yourself. Sitting in on the keynote, I was struck by Professor Davies' question about whether South Asians became nations or they became free over the course of the 20th century. For as he comments, these things have different trajectories, which is maybe a little counterintuitive. My thinking, I hope, approaches a similar question, but from a different angle. I've really been provoked in a positive way by the conclave organizers' references to Benedict Anderson's and Rob Nixon's community figurations, whether that's the imagined or the unimagined community, as well as the organizers' interest in the effective ties created in part by literary cultures and the organizers' call for greater inclusivity in the future. These focal points coalesce, I think, in reading practices. And that's where I'm starting, with reading. I'm testing a line of thought that starts with how we read, from where, really, and for what, to see how these practices connect us to communities, or as you'll see, to publics. Fundamentally, my questions invite us to think about the work reading literature does in or around nationalism's imagined communities. In what follows, I'm going to ask you to listen for 3 sections, one called reading, one called imagining, and one called public sizing. So reading. My title deliberately echoes Annette Kolodny's reminder from her 1980 groundbreaking second wave feminism essay called Dancing Through the Minefield. In this essay, Kolodny says, Insofar as literature itself is a social institution, so too reading is a highly socialized or learned activity, end quote. In the context of this conclave, Kolodny's assertion prompts us to work through not just the what of what we read, but the how of it too. What reading practices afford meaning? What practices foreclose upon meaning? How are these practices implicated in nationalist or other exclusivist narratives and the forms and tropes they prefer? When are these practices liberatory, if ever? Through an examination of reading practices, we can, if Kolodny's figuration holds, more intentionally engage the social institutions that shape collective lives and realities. Of course, reading and interpretation hinge upon language, and questions of language or issues surrounding language connect Kolodny's assertion even more explicitly to questions of nationalism as another prime social institution to which literature can draw our attention or our affective attachments. These questions of language are multifaceted. To illustrate how, let me back up a bit. I come to these questions about reading in two primary ways. First, as an educator, as a teacher, right? And then also as a researcher. First, from my position as a white female educator located in the United States who teaches texts from elsewhere, from outside of the United States, at predominantly white institutions, so most of my students are white, I prefer and often make a point of selecting world Anglophone texts rather than those in translation. Without getting into the specifics of this preference, I will say the cultural differences between my students and the imagined worlds of these texts can be profound. I've had students admit to me that they rename characters in these Anglophone texts in order to remember the characters. When prodded, these students often further divulge that for these texts to be meaningful, so quote unquote meaningful to them, they need to identify with the texts in some way. The act of renaming the characters helps them do so. Sometimes I make a point of including Brian Friel's play, the Irish playwright's play translations, or Jamaica Kincaid, the Caribbean author, her book called My Garden Book, precisely so students can start to see the imperial impulse behind their renaming efforts. Reading as identification, which is exactly what my students are doing, takes on serious resonances when framed by Kolodny's point about reading as a way we learn to be a part of social institutions. My somewhat sly mention of texts like Friel's or Kincaid's that take on naming as a colonial act points toward the types of social institutions reading as identification might interpolate us into, namely social institutions that subordinate the other to consolidate the self. But as I just noted, I also come to these questions about language, about reading, from my position as a white monolingual researcher who specializes in the literary culture of another nation, a nation thoroughly multilingual and hence polyvocal. I mean Pakistan, of course, a nation whose history pivots has always pivoted on language protests, a history everyone in this space right now knows too well. The centripetal pull of nationalism in this nation's history gives the question of reading as identification much different contours, or at least I think it does. In multilingual contexts where false flags of unity wave, what social institutions do we enter, and from which are we barred when the language in which we read is the central issue, if you're not reading in your mother tongue, for example? Or in other words, can reading as identification operate differently in multilingual contexts? Under what conditions? Can it operate differently, for that matter, even in monolingual ones? The next section on imagining. To address these questions, we need some understanding of what it means to read any language alongside others who are reading to. As we know, Benedict Anderson focuses on the roles of language in reading and nationalism. Famously, Anderson cites newspapers as one conduit that draws readers to a sense of nation as an imagined community. And he reminds us that, quote, print language is what invents nationalism, not a particular language per se, end quote. But newspapers do not know, if they can know anything, I'm anthropomorphizing newspapers. Newspapers do not know definitively who reads them. There's an element of strangeness in the newspaper's formation of community. So can we so neatly tie print language and the acts of reading associated with it to the invention and maintenance of a nationalist consciousness? On this question, Anderson seems persuaded to answer yes. At the same time, in his analysis of the nationalism's decolonization gives rise to, Anderson warns, quote, it is always a mistake to treat languages in the way that certain nationalist ideologies treat them, as emblems of nationness, like flags, costumes, folk dances, and the rest. Much the most important thing about language is its capacity for generating imagined communities, building, in effect, and he italicizes this, particular solidarities. Language is fundamentally inclusive, end quote. In short, any language's use in a newspaper, according to Anderson, operates to pull people to affective bonds with the nation and other imaginary things, and to each other. Reading's the thing, as far as nationalism is concerned, not the language being read. In his nod towards Anderson's work in unimagined communities, Rob Nixon seems persuaded otherwise. That is, Nixon partially acknowledges how print language and reading might operate differently than Anderson suggests. This essay, whose subtitle is Developmental Refugees, Megadams, and Monumental Modernity, points out that big dams make visible a nation's modernity with greater impact than does a rise in its literacy rates. Still, Nixon focuses intently on reading and writing. For instance, Nixon compares the writerly approaches of a set of American authors on the one hand and Arundhati Roy on the other. The approaches they take in their objections to their respective nations' big dam projects. According to Nixon, the American authors, including John Moore, who was a 19th century writer, Wallace Stegner, a 20th century American writer, appeal to a wilderness ethic, which is an ethos and an aesthetic that, in its American iteration, effaces the nation's genocidal relations to indigenous populations in order to craft strong, effective claims to majestic nature as inherent to belonging to the American nation, or as Nixon says, to nature's nation. Note that I'm using the words genocidal relations to indigenous populations, not Nixon. That's my act of reading that doesn't recognize my identity in the effective ties to Americanness the wilderness ethic beckons and reinforces. Nixon is, though, careful to note that the environmental justice movement rights within did not exist when these American writers penned their DAM, D-A-M, objections. Does this fact excuse their exclusions? I suppose we need to think more about how their exclusions still possess an effective draw for contemporary readers and at what locations these readers engage these texts. Nixon's brief mention of the American environmental writers is why the essay only partially acknowledges the possibility that print language operates differently than Anderson suggests. Yet Nixon's review of environmental writing spans a century and continents, and in doing so, eventually casts reading in a different way. In his treatment of Roy's anti-dam and other activist writings, for instance, Nixon gestures toward how Roy's audiences may be in a way that he argues doesn't apply to American writers. Indeed, Nixon notes, quote, the historical timing, geographical circumstances, and rhetorical strategies of Roy's by now classic essay, He Means the Greater Common Good, set it apart in significant ways from the dominant strains of American anti-megadam literature, end quote. Nixon notes that Roy, quote, sought to expose the collusions between a fascist strain of Hindu nationalism at home and neoliberal globalizers, notably the megadam boosters at the World Bank and in the Western-based global dam industry, which one notes, like the tobacco industry, was shifting its exploitative center of gravity to the global south, where huge profits could be accumulated in conditions where health, safety, and environmental regulations were absent, lax, or poorly enforced, end quote. That's a lot of heavy lifting for Roy's essay to be doing. In short, according to Nixon, Roy writes to a world audience and to an Indian one. Her vehicle is, of course, English. How is Roy's English different than, say, Muir's or Stegner's for contemporary readers? Do different English readers read these deployments of English differently? That is, do they identify or not identify with them differently? Are the differences connected to the social institutions with which these readers identify or to which they're hailed effectively? I don't have any answers to these questions. I'm asking you. I'm curious just to hear what you think. I'm moving into the last section on publicizing. In reviewing Anderson's focus on print language, like newspapers, and their role in the invention of a nationalist consciousness, I paused on the strangeness of a newspaper's audience, its readership, as a possible opening for different reading practices that may not all coalesce in an imagined commonality forged by some form of identification. Nixon's take on Roy expands how print language and the reading of it operates. The net's cast wide and unknowable here, as Nixon traces Roy's audience through a global network. This strangeness and unknowability offer an opportunity to consider the relevance of public, as a term public, as a more generative formulation than community, as we think through the work reading literature or any text does in relation to nationalism. Michael Werner's work on publics in his essay, Publics and Counterpublics, echoes Anderson's framing of nationalism as an imagined community. Werner characterizes a text's readers as a, quote, discourse public. Discourse publics engage with a, quote, class of writing contexts, including literary criticism, journalism, theory, advertising, fiction, drama, most poetry, whose available addressees are essentially imaginary, which is not to say unreal, end quote. To say imaginary is not to mean pretend. Rather, as Werner continues, quote, all discourse public addressees have some social basis, end quote, that can't be fully known or anticipated in advance. This inability to know, which isn't a handicap, establishes strangeness as constitutive of a discourse public. Or as Werner further argues, quote, a discourse public is always in excess of its known social basis, end quote. This excessiveness matters because it joins us in what Werner calls stranger relationality, a way of organizing that, quote, unites strangers through participation, that is through reading alone, at least in theory, end quote. Such connections with strangers are unlike how, quote, nations, religions, races, guilds, and so on select strangers by criteria of territory or identity or belief or some other test of membership, end quote. The difference matters because it multiplies the possible ways we read. That is, we are at one and the same time connected to imaginary others through selective criteria such as religion, race, and nation, and through stranger relationality by virtue of our participation in acts of reading. How do we manage these connections as we engage with texts? How does the social institution of reading as a learned activity lead us to, or through, or away from other social institutions? How can we be pulled both to a national consciousness and apart from it? I think here of how I read Nixon's discussion of the American anti-dam writers. I see and I feel the pull of Americanness these writers invoke. Yet I have some distance from it too, some non-identification. Is this both and an indicator of my belonging in both an imagined community and a discourse public? Would the same be true if I was bi or multilingual, if I wasn't American? My hope is that the questions emerging from my efforts to put Anderson, Nixon, and Warner in conversation prompt insights from you in your roles as students, as educators, as researchers, as readers, as humans. This is where, if time had permitted, I would have asked you about Recitative, about Toni Morrison's short story, and what you made of it. I do it with my American students. I've never done it with non-American students. And so I'm really curious to know, how does it, how do you read it? How do you approach it? You're all able to read English. You're all fluent in English. How do you understand what Morrison is doing? What effective ties is she invoking in you? You can say I could go on forever, but I'm going to finish. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, so I was spellbound the way, you covered so many things. So about reading, imagining, and publicizing, as you mentioned. And of course, I was reminded of Barthesian divide between readerly and writerly text. So you focused on the readerly aspect of it. But what about language dominated writerly text like that of Jem Joyce and others? I'm sure our audience would have lots of questions to ask. If you can hang around, I know it's midnight for you. Would you like to hang around for the second speech or?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So in that case, we'll take the questions at the end of the other speech that we have. And we talked about the affective quality of literature. And literature, as we know, is news that stays news, right? That's what Ezra Pound said. And we have a newsman among us, and I'm delighted to welcome our very own, scholar in residence, educator, writer. So to say that he's prolific and versatile is an understatement. So we have Mr. Sudeep Chakravarti among us, and I'll just give you a glimpse of his bio, just to give you some idea, of what he has been doing in the last few decades. So Sudeep Chakravarti is an author, independent researcher, analyst, columnist, media consultant, and of course, he is now at ULAB as a visiting faculty in the Department of English and also at the Media Studies Department. So he's the author of several books of nonfiction, including The Eastern Gate, War and Peace in Nagaland, Manipur, and India's Far East, The Battle That Changed the Course of Indian History, and of course, The Bengalis, A Portrait of a Community, so which he'll be talking about today. So he has written 3 novels and several short stories, and as a South Asia specialist, Sudeep contributes to many magazines all over the world, like Mint, Asian Wall Street Journal, Die Welt, India Today, Sunday, Hindustan Times, Outlook, and many more. And he began his career with the Asian Wall Street Journal and eventually moved on to Sunday Magazine, India Today. And of course, he is the executive editor of Newspaper Today, India's first digital newspaper, launched by India Today Group. And in his various media roles and functions, Sudeep worked across domains of reporting, writing, editing, planning, and management. So I'm so glad that Dr. Cilano mentioned Arundhati Roy about activism and literature, and now we have activism here. So over to Sudeep.
You know, Professor Shamsad, you have this habit of getting people in trouble. So but I forgive you. And as you've guessed, ladies and gentlemen, friends, that from the title of my talk and the abstract, that I wish to speak very seriously, but also somewhat tongue in cheek, because I think that is emblematic of the Bengali people, Bengali history, Bengali culture, and the universe that the Bengalis, as a people, we inhabit. Which I have. When I was writing this book, The Bengalis: A Portrait of a Community, a few years ago, it was published 4 years ago. I was thinking of a term, what to call this universe that the Bengali people inhabit, and it came quite easily. I called it Bangla's sphere, for lack of anything else, and it stuck with me. But it sort of gave rise to other thoughts within this sort of heaving, seething, chaotic, hopeful, aspirational, hugely identity-driven, proud, linguistically almost over the top, and we're driven by our language more than anything else. And Bangladesh will know that more than most, having shed the blood of 2 to 3 million of its own brothers and sisters for the sake of being able to speak, read, and write in Bangla. It's an enormous, enormous history that Bangla's sphere carries, and Bangladesh in particular carries. And this is just for friends who are not from Bangladesh. I mean, we just celebrated Ekushe, 21st of February in Bangladesh, which is also coincidentally the International Mother Language Day, which recognizes from Bangladesh's overture to this sort of very emphatic claiming of its language, which actually drives its present day and culture and identity, and will continue to do so. So that's Bangla's sphere. But within Bangla's sphere, you have others away from Bangladesh, which contains 2/3 of the world's Bengalis, but you have India, which contains more or less the other 1/3 in the state of West Bengal, elsewhere in India, in Assam, and of course, Bengalis being sort of travel mad and sort of wonderful travelers for several hundred years. They're all over the world. So Bangla's sphere includes the world now, and has for many hundreds of years. But this, within Bangla's sphere, this sort of the lines of blood, and it is, when I call it a seething, heaving kind of universe, and it is so because within the sphere we too have, we are driven, we have been driven by hatreds, we have been driven by securities, we have been driven by these factors as well, which carry us through to the present day, which is unfortunate, but this is also the truth. And that's where, when I shamelessly borrowed from my friend Amitav Ghosh's very, very fine novel, The Shadowed Lines, as part of my title of my talk, it was deliberate because, these are the shadow areas and the shadow geographies, and not just of physicality or borders, but also shadow lines in our minds and in our hearts and souls, which carry us too. And I'm sorry, I get a bit worked up when I talk about this, but forgive me. I mean, the Bengalis would understand. I am Bengali after all. So, this is part of my DNA. But, this goes back a bit because, the hatreds of partition, they follow us, they track us, they feed quite a few of us in Bangladesh and certainly in West Bengal. And this hatred, which is sort of dissipated somewhat after 1971, sort of spontaneous empathy for the birth of Bangladesh and his role in it, the Bengaliness of this entire project, in many ways, it is unfortunately this hatred, which sort of has resurfaced in some ways, and it's engineered in many ways, is an active ingredient of politics, hardline politics in Bangladesh, and certainly hardline politics in India. Indeed, we have seen an upsurge since 2010, in particular, in the Indian Bangla sphere, if you will, which has become part of a national discourse in India, and particularly during the elections to the Assembly of West Bengal. The Assembly elections were held in April 2021. We saw a huge uptick of this sort of engineered hatred and suspicions that I'm talking about. It's when I was working on the book, actually, when I'm a living, breathing Bengali, so it's something that I've seen from my childhood. And when I was working on this book and before that and subsequent to that, it struck me that, I wanted to go back to just where the roots are. And, it's the attitudes that have been driven by 18th century attitudes, 19th century attitudes, early 20th century attitudes. And unfortunately, in the run-up to the independence of India and Pakistan, and then subsequent eruptions, you've had this sort of cringe-worthy sort of anger, this kind of hatreds and insecurities and defensive behaviors that come through. But this deep-rooted religious schism, which is the basis of much of this, that has permeated Bengali history for over 100 years, which only the most liberal in Bangla sphere have been able to overcome. And this is not just the urban liberals, but also the rural liberals, where I think actually the true Bengali liberal resides, because unlike this pocket of liberalism in urban Bangla sphere, in rural Bangla sphere, you actually have far more syncretism and far more folksy intermingling of religion for the longest time, for several hundred years. So anyway, that's another story for another day. But I've seen liberal Muslims in Bangladesh and West Bengal, for all their talk of togetherness of language and culture and secular ideals that are apparently ingrained in Bengali culture, in particular rural Bengali culture, appear terribly hurt that they have been traditionally, historically looked down upon by the Bengali Hindu, particularly in the Indian Bangla sphere. They were so very upset, and I've had this told to me every so often by writers, that the writers, like the great Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, and not Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who was very proudly a Hindu, and whose seminal works like Ananda Math came to be a beacon for both Bengali Hindu resurgence and Indian nationalism. So not him, but the other Chattopadhyay, Sharat Chandra, who's largely seen as an emancipator of women, a celebrated voice for the poor and oppressed, and his works have been transformed into instant classics. Now, I had this lady, when I met this sort of upper crust lady in Dhaka, a liberal and elderly society lady, whose name I will not take because you all know her. She just sort of asked me, how could Sharat Chandra write such a thing? And she was referring to his 4-part novel, Srikanto, within the first few pages of which there is a description, a recollection of an evening in a village where Srikanto meets Indranath, a character, and where Indranath saves Srikanto. And I will just say it in Bangla and explain it in English. Iskuler mathe Bangali o Musulman chhatroder football match Shondha hoy hoy mogno hoiya dekhitechi. It was nearly evening. There was a football match on in the school grounds between Bengali and Muslim students. Important. I watched transfixed. And soon in the same paragraph, as I note and I've written about, a fight breaks out, the playing field empties, but Srikanto is confused and he's rooted to the spot, unable to escape, and he's surrounded by several Muslim boys. And here Sharat Chandra writes, পাঁচ-সাতজন মুসলমান ছোকরা তখন আমাদের চারিদিকে দেহ রচনা করিয়াছে. So, it was more like they surrounded the boys. And here, I just have always wondered why this sort of difference between Bengali students and Muslim students when the Muslim students are also Bengali. Anyway, so, this is a sort of a inherited history on the basis of which several of our prejudices in the 20th century have been based. And as I explained a little earlier at the beginning of my remarks, that they carry on to 2021, 2022. It's remarkable. But, even as I say this, there is, and let me move to the other aspect, which is the transitional aspect, which is a very wonderful thing, where not just the liberals, but I think what has happened is that this sort of mincing self-righteousness, the sort of mincing arrogance that many people that I've seen in the Indian Bangla sphere, feel towards the people in Bangladesh, whether they're Muslim or Hindu or you name it, just a citizen of Bangladesh, without recognizing for a moment that Bangladesh actually means a country of Bengalis, which West Bengal does not mean. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. So these subcontinental atrocities and the subcontinental arrogances and hubris, if you will, which continue to the present day, are somewhat tempered, I think, friends, which, by what I would call Bangladesh's trinity of aspiration, recognition of its achievement, and sort of a respect for what Bangladesh has achieved in these 50 years since 1971. So it has moved on, and I think that, my friends, is adding greatly to a changing perception in the Indian Bangla sphere for sure. And I think that has led to a positive blurring of lines, the shadow lines. They've coalesced into sort of people are beginning to understand, I think, beginning to appreciate the meaninglessness of the sort of schisms that have been driven by our unfortunate histories, wonderful histories too, which is what's, I think, bringing us forward, sort of dragging us out from the cesspit of negative history into sort of a, let me be very purple prose over here, which I hate, but let me just indulge myself for a minute or two and say, to basically to sunshine, that's it. I mean, to the light of day, to the light of reality. And here I can't help but sort of invoke my friend and fellow writer and also one of the patrons of ULAB, Qazi Anis Ahmed, and I interviewed Anis for the Bengalis, and I was sitting in Dhaka talking to him, and he said, Sudeep, let me just tell you this one thing straight away. And he said it to tease me, but he also said it because he meant it, in a teasing way, but it was, as I said, just half teasing. He said, the Bengalis in India have a province, the Bengalis in Bangladesh have a country. And, so that was to me a nice way of putting it. And I looked at him and I said, you wicked, wicked man. Trust you, and needs to say something like that. But the man has a sense of humor. Let us give it to him. And, but I took Dr. Anis's point very, very well, because it was a thing. And I think that is something that people in the Indian Bangla sphere, or who emanate from Indian Bangla sphere, are beginning to recognize. And most importantly, the Bengalis of Bangladesh, or the Bangladeshis themselves, are beginning to recognize and have recognized, is that there is no longer a requirement to benchmark Bangladesh with India, or Bangladesh with West Bengal, or Dhaka with Calcutta, because there is simply no need. And I think that benchmark was fallacious to begin with. It was incorrect. It was sort of unfortunate, but I think Bangladesh has broken away from it. It's more than reached escape velocity. It's in its own orbit right now. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, which is sort of reorienting the perception of, in Bangla sphere, of what exactly the Bangladeshi aspect of Bangla sphere has achieved, which is wonderful. And, and people are beginning to realize, and I think people are in the Indian Bangla sphere are beginning to see it, because in India, unfortunately, from the colonial times, and here I mean the British colonial times, not in Bangladesh, because you folks in Bangladesh see, the folks in Bangladesh see colonialism twice over, once of Britain and then the second time of Pakistan. That's a loaded statement, and I would stand by it. But what I'm trying to say is that there is this this aspect where, in India, I've personally faced it as a citizen of India and as a Bengali, where people have said, "Oh, you guys are, the Bengalis are absolutely no good. You are absolutely, you people have no martial prowess, and you are Abhitu Bengalis. You are cowardly Bengalis. You're not in the army, you're not in the Air Force, you're not in the Navy, you haven't fought for the Indian War of Independence, which is or the Indian Mutiny, and you've done this and you haven't done that, and so on and so forth." Now, that is a history, as we all know, is a history that is driven by the British colonialist enterprise. Actually, and it has been proven by no less a person than Lord Curzon himself, when he triggered a shifting of the capital of British India from Kolkata to Delhi, because he had enough of Bengali revolutionaries, among other things. So, the Bengalis were not exactly Pitu, Kapurush, cowardly Bengalis who were sort of, but that's another story. But here, people forget that, even in the Indian Bangladesh, the first Air Marshal, Chief of the Air Force of independent India, was Air Marshal Subrata Mukherjee. I had friendly relations with a Chief of Army Staff, General Shankar Roy Chaudhary. They've been numerous admirals and marshals, of the Air Force and generals in the Indian Army and paramilitaries who have been Bengali, who have had absolutely no issue with martial prowess, and neither has the country that commissioned them. Indeed, it is an absolutely ridiculous argument when you look at Bangladesh, where this argument doesn't exist, where you have most senior officers of the armed forces, of the three branches of the defense and forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force, they've been Bengalis. This is a ridiculous argument about martial prowess. These kind of fallacies have been imposed on the Bengalis, and I think the Bengalis, at least in India's sphere, have sort of unhappily adopted these as well. The other thing is about Bengalis having no sense of business and this is the thing that is said over and over again, without realizing that in the 17th and 18th centuries and hundreds of years before, you had people, including Prince Dwarkanath Tagore, an ancestor of Rabindranath Tagore, who was called Dwarki by the British in Calcutta very fondly because he was in business partnership with them. You had absolute captains of industry and trade in Bengal. And again, that is such a silly statement to have made, because when you take that to Bangladesh, what do you say? I mean, the Bengalis of Bangladesh has created the garment exporting growth engine that makes Bangladesh now the third largest garment exporting power in the world after China, and since last year, Vietnam. Bangladesh is through the corona pandemic, Bangladesh's economy has flowered, has blossomed. It remains one of the fastest growing economies in Asia and in the world, and it's driven by a 90% plus population of Bengalis. Where are these arguments? These lines that have been placed in front of us I think, are absolutely ridiculous, and it's well past the sell-by date of how Bangla sphere sees itself and how these shadow lines, the interplay of the shadow lines play. I think we need to be far more conscious of it. I will end here because this is something and a subject that I'm very emotional about, and I can continue for several hours. But I will end in a funny way that even with these shadow lines, the Bengalis have for many hundreds of years been joined by a certain sense of sassiness, which I think also afflicted with Lord Curzon and Lord Hardinge were affected by it, and the British Empire was affected by it. I'll give you an example. When this is a little anecdotal thing, which I will end with. I'll tell you a story about how a bunch of Bengalis went to New Zealand, of all places, and they jumped ship, East India Company ship in 1814. There were 6 of them who jumped ship in Otago Harbour in New Zealand, and 3 of them sort of made their way, and they adopted the Maori language. They integrated themselves with the Maori society. One of them even married a Maori person who took the moko. So you had a Bengali Laskar or Loshkar from Chittagong who actually took the moko. And then the 3 of them went about doing the most Bengali thing. They went about teaching the Maori chieftains of the area and the Maori people as to how to fight the British overlords. So I mean, that was an incredibly Bengali thing to do way back in the early 19th century. You have other instances as well in New Zealand where a gentleman, again from present-day Bangladesh, jumped ship from a ship called the City of Edinburgh in 1810. He deserted, and you'll find the examples of this book in diasporic works and encyclopedias, and in particular a book edited by Professor Shekhar Bandopadhyay, where in a chapter called The Indian Migration to the Pacific and Indian Ocean States, which also talks about the migrations from East Bengal and present-day Bangladesh. You'll have these fascinating instances of this, this sort of explosion of Bengalis into this greater Bangla sphere, which includes every part of the world as we speak. So there are these fascinating bits of history, fascinating bits of politics, fascinating bits of ethnography, of religion, and literature and culture, and which unfortunately Bengalis tend to think that we have the best in the world. That is a hubris that we continue to carry. But when I speak of the Bengalis and the shadow lines that we see in Bangla sphere, my sincere hope and feeling is that I'm really, really pleased that we are being able to overcome both in the Bangladeshi Banglasphere and outside of it, that in the greater aspect that we have, I think we are breaking away despite the worst impulses that we see, political impulses and religious or political impulses that we see in the subcontinent, to denigrate and demean this sort of syncretism and Bengaliness, if you will, of the subcontinent and in Bangladesh. Despite worst aspects of that, I am extremely hopeful that to see that the best of Bangladesh is breaking through from the top to the bottom, or from the bottom to the top. We are claiming Bangladesh for what it is, what it should be, for what Bengalis claim it, which is liberal, which is syncretic, which is educated, which is argumentative, which is chaotic, which is organized, which is aspirational, which is all of the above, and everything that Bangladesh will make it in the next few years, decades, and centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sudeep Chakravarti, for blurring the shadow lines and also debunking some of these stereotypes, about being coward and all that. Yeah, the floor is now open. So I would probably give my own comments. If you want to respond to each other, if you want to write your questions on the chat room, feel free to ask questions. So the floor is, we have 10 minutes for Q&A. And thank you both speakers for sticking to time. So that's again, not very Bengali. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. If you want to respond to one another, so maybe our audience needs a bit warmer.
I actually do have a question for Professor Chakravarti.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of things that you said that I'm wondering how they stand in relation to each other. So, for example, you pointed out these 18th, 19th, 20th century attitudes that just keep moving into the next generation, right? Keep still having some resonance in the contemporary period. How are these attitudes transmitted?
Well, thank you very much, and Doctor, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. So thank you for that. And my compliments. You're awake in Michigan. So my compliments for that above all else. So, but it's a very valid point, and it's something that we are grappling to understand ourselves, because it's part of our ongoing history, our life history, if you will. And these are transmitted. I'll give you a most recent example. Instead of going back to these 2 or 3 centuries, let me talk about what's happening, for instance, in India primarily, and also somewhat in Bangladesh, and they sort of feed off each other, if you will. The negative energies always feed off each other for the most cynical manner, and these are engineered attitudes now. I believe that they were engineered from the word go, and they continue to be engineered as sort of political points of political leverage, points to win elections, points to essentially for political gain. And in India, for instance, in West Bengal, there's been a studious endeavor by the Hindu right-wing political establishment, which is also is a huge enterprise. It's backed by several thousand NGOs, which practice, which run schools, which run, and here schools, I mean high schools, primary schools, secondary schools, schools in rural areas, urban schools, and schools as you would see it in America, the colleges, the universities, and NGOs that look after tribal affairs, NGOs that look after Muslims. So, this right-wing Hindu enterprise also has a Muslim outreach cell, for instance, and which is sort of a benevolent outreach, naturally. It comes from a sense of arrogance and a sense of paternalism. But they have, so the political establishment is backed by this sort of grand organization, this sort of spiritual organization, primarily the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and its adjuncts, but there are other other elements to it as well. And you have similar organizations in Bangladesh, you have similar organizations in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world. I mean, these are not surprising, only that I'm sort of gobsmacked by the efficiency of the Hindu right-wing socio-political enterprise, if I may put it like that. So, for instance, in West Bengal, when they were trying to drum up political energies to win votes in the West Bengal Assembly elections, which happened in the spring of 2021, they used all these elements. It was a multi-pronged attack, if you will, which this organization describes as total politics, which is anything goes. So it went with education or brainwashing, if you will, or saffron washing, if you will, in their pet institutes and NGOs and organizations, which then were played into media, which were played into blogs. There is something called the BJP IT cell, IT Information Technology cell, which is extremely active on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, with fake accounts, with you name it, with trolls and robots and so on and so forth. And so they just plastered the hate, the message of hate, and the message of insecurity that West Bengal would be taken over, elect the incumbent government, and West Bengal would be overrun by the Musliman. It was said in as many words in election speeches. So I'm not indulging in a slander or libel. Slander. It is on the record. It is easily available on Google. So this is how it was approached, and this has been the approach, which was it's sort of a provincial approach to a national approach, which this enterprise, the socio-political enterprise, adopted in the run-up to the parliamentary elections to India in 2014. And it is basically a subset, a localized ethno-linguistic, ethno-religious subset applied to West Bengal, which was applied to all of India in the run-up to the elections in 2014 that was applied in West Bengal. So it's a very well-oiled machinery right now. And they are, fake news, deep fakes is only the surface. It goes extremely deep, very ingrained, very organized, supremely efficient, and utterly ruthless. That's how it works.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I noticed, in both of your presentations, is the pose of a right center culture itself. And you ended it's a shame that we didn't do Tony, but outside the well, so in the teaching machine, so where do you locate yourself? But my question to you both is actually when you're dealing with fact and fiction, so because Sudeep Chakravarti trades both fact and fiction, just like Arundhati Roy. And I've always asked myself this question, that at what point in time a non-fiction writer needs fiction to deal with facts?
Dr. Cara, would you like to go first? Because you do have a view on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, it makes me think about 19th century American writer Henry David Thoreau in Walden, right, which is a nonfiction chronicle of the time that he spends living on the shore of Walden Pond in solitude, and he's fed up with the myths of the depths of Walden Pond. Right, in the town, among the townspeople, among the fishermen, they've got all these stories, all these fantastical stories about the bottomlessness of Walden Pond. And he's like, I'll have none of it. I will measure it. And he measures it. He comes up with a whole way with a big stone, and he measures it. And he's basically, okay, now that I know the depth of Walden Pond, I can imagine. It opens up a curiosity. It opens up a whole series of questions that now can spring forth from my imagination. So there is this balance between knowing the parameters of something real and moving from that to understand something possible.
That's interesting. And for me, professors, it's quite simple. and I wouldn't be telling you something that you all don't already know. But I inhabit this universe, and every project or every article or short story or nonfiction work or novel that I try and attempt, I have to straight off the bat try and see how it is to be best told. And now you have or can it be a play? Can it be a screenplay? Can it be a poem? It doesn't have to be this fiction or nonfiction in terms of short fiction or long fiction or narrative nonfiction or an essay, nonfiction essay. It can be anything. So, and I think that's a wonderful thing because we are increasingly being able to address these areas. For instance, take the book that we're talking that I referred to, the Bengalis. I could have written about sort of a satirical, humorous, historical sort of send up of the Bengalis in a fictional manner. I could have created these wonderful characters and told the story, the sort of this standard operating procedure of this generational saga, if you will, that begins, in candlelight in sort of a red brick house in North Calcutta in late 19th century, and then carries on to the present day. I could have done that, but I thought that it is to talk about a people instead of taking the route of fiction, which many of my colleagues have done actually, including wonderfully my good friend Neil Mukherjee. It was very easy for me to adopt a nonfiction route because because of so many strands that I had to bring together, which involves the Bengalis, the history, culture, ethnography, schisms, religious, whatever, the future, everything. And to make it credible, to make it believable, I needed to do it in a manner with nonfiction. Though I employ very, very frequently fictional inputs, like we talked about Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel, Srikanto, as an input to this book. So of course, I don't ignore all of that, the fictional inputs of Bengaliness, of Bengali culture and history. But I thought it would be, if I did it emphatically with narrative nonfiction, employing history, culture, ethnography, so on and so forth, in every possible way, it would be more credible, it would be a better vehicle for telling the story in this particular case than a work of fiction. So I think writers juggle with this all the time, and I'm very happy to inhabit this sort of a creative schizophrenic space, if you will. And I say this without ism. I say this with the greatest sense of not to demean people with that thing. I'm very, very conscious of these things, but I'm just using this as a way of saying, let me call it parallel universes. I think that's a more appropriate way of addressing it. I think that's a more correct way, and I apologize for not saying that earlier. So it is a parallel universe that one has to inhabit in order to be a writer, I think. So that's it from me.
Excellent. So yeah, that's another shadow lines for you, right? Right. Thank you so much. There is one question for Dr. Cilano, but we're actually running out of time. So if you can quickly respond to that, and because we need to go to the breakout sessions for the parallel sessions, the parallel universe. Okay. So Dr. Cilano, over to you.
So the question that was in the chat?
Yes, it's about the hegemonic role of
right. So reading from the minority position. I offered a comment in reply. I think it's reading from that minority position is such a key side of inquiry as we think about whether reading can in fact be an act of resistance or an act of liberation. So I would be very curious, not having been in that position myself, as a monolingual speaker, really curious about what the experience is like. Are there forms of identification that occur, or are there opportunities to resist those forms of identity? Much like Professor Chakravarti's presentation regarding the stereotypes that, why do we still hold these things? And so is there an opportunity to not identify and thereby, engage in reading as resistance?
Excellent. All right. On that note, so we will say good night to Dr. Cilano. And thank you so much. That was a fascinating panel. So really appreciate you waking up. So hope this does not turn out to be a nightmare for Dr. Cilano, but for the rest, please stay awake for the rest of the sessions. We have some exciting papers coming along, and we will transport ourselves to the parallel universe. Right. So thank you so much for joining, and yeah. So it's becoming exciting, right? Okay, thank you, Dr. Cilano and Sudeep Chakravarti, for your wonderful presentation. So I'm sure
Take
our
care.
audience
Thank
loved
you.
it a lot. Thank you so
Be
much.
well.
Thank you for your
Bye-bye.
time. All right then, bye bye. Sarah, over to you.
Sir, thank you, Professor Cara Cilano, Professor Sudeep Chakravarti, and Professor Shamsul Mortaza for this very interesting plenary session. Dear audience, this brings us to the end of this session in the main room for now.